Hello, welcome to Microsoft Certified Professional Developer 4.0 with ASP.NET and C#. The content exam focus is 70-515, and the content is owned and created by Ravi Nanganuri, Microsoft MVP, .NET-Videos.net. So video number 20, we're going to continue on with MVC, talk about ASP.MVC. I encourage you to watch video number 19 if you haven't done so. So with ASP.NET 4.0 MVC, routing is the URL matching a resource. Again, not necessarily the URL matching a classic file on disk like you would see with web forms. So we need to understand routing and begin to explore the concepts in depth to truly master MVC. Now, routes in MVC map requests to controller actions. So as we'll see this, the actual routes themselves map to the requests to the actual controller actions. And they also construct the outgoing URLs that match a controller action. So it's a bidirectional thing. It maps the request as well as constructs outgoing URLs that you're sending to match a controller action. Now, every MVC application needs at least one route. This is created for you and housed in the global.asax file. So if you just fire up a new MVC app, it's off and running. And you don't even necessarily have to see it, but the plumbing we'll dig into in this video. Now, you can work with parameters in the URL a couple different ways with MVC. You can use classic query string parameters, as we'll show, or you can also use URL segments. Have a very clean URL experience with parameters. We'll show that. And again, we need to begin to understand routing to truly master MVC. So we'll dive into that and explore those fundamentals in this video. Now, it's important to note that HTML helpers help you at MVC with rendering HTML markup. So with your views, you have full control over the way the HTML and everything is handled, which is great, and it's just a very nice thing about MVC in general. But there's times when you're going to want some help for some common scenarios. HTML helpers are the way that happens. We'll look at those at the end of this video. So I just have a simple MVC application set up here at this point. And I'm in the global ASAX file already, and this register routes method of the global ASAX file actually defines this one route. Every MVC application, again, uses one route. We've got an ignore route here for like the built-in .NET stuff with the AXD stuff, and I've got the routes.map route, and it's just an arbitrary name. It's named default, and then it's named controller action and ID for these various segments of the URL itself. And as we'll see, those names are actually important and keywords for the MVC conventions here. And notice I've just got this new keyword where I'm using controller equal to home, and then action equals index, and then an empty string for ID, which we could use for parameters. I'm going to comment all this out so that we can dig a little bit deeper. I'm going to define a new route. Now, you can define multiple routes for your applications depending on how complicated or sophisticated your nav paths are, and everything you're doing with your app can kind of drive how many routes you need. Again, you need at least one. I'm just going to name one called basic here, just to name it different than the word default. And for now, I'll give this a first, second, and third, or I could use first, second, and ID for my URL segments here. But so these URL segments, which I've called first, second, and third, if we was just to go ahead and run this at this point, you notice it compiles just fine. I'm just creating a route here. You don't have like a compile time way of telling whether or not this is going to match. You can you can create these routes with any arbitrary names you want, but the convention that MVC is using by default with the controller and the action, those keywords are going to become important if you want to use kind of everything just as default out of the box, so to speak. So I'll go ahead and just run this, demonstrate what I'm talking about. And you'll notice that I have a very clean URL up here, nothing going on at all actually on it, but I also have nothing going on the page. It'll immediately, resource cannot be found. So we'll take this a step further. You're going to have the controller down here. I'm going to call this controller and action. I'll fast forward through this a bit. Just like the above route was created. And those are keywords that are actually going to use this convention to dictate where our resources are. So we'll use the controller action segments there, and then ID. And then I'll go ahead and rerun this at this point, and now all of a sudden I'm up and running. Okay, so I've pasted in an appropriate route, kind of mimicking that first route. And we'll dive into kind of what each of these segments are here in a second. But if you look at the bottom here, if I name this back to first and second, and I just left ID there, this is not going to work. Even though I've got a new controller at the bottom where we're referencing the home controller, and again the action set the index. If I run this, there's no matching in the back end to any resources that are there that are available. Our stuff is living in the actual controllers directory. And we have various action methods we're going to be using. So those keywords are important. And if I go ahead and rerun this at this point, this should now run again. So be aware of this. Some of this, what's called convention over configuration, MVC expects certain things. It's going to expect this keyword for my routes by default. I would have to change directory structures and this type of stuff if not. Notice when I've got a new controller here, I do have some IntelliSense here to help, but we're actually referencing resources with these URL segments here, not necessarily files on disk, not necessarily like web forms where you've got classic ASPX pages. We're saying, hey, when the routes themselves are going to match or map to various resources for our application. So let's look at this in a little more depth. If you come in and you look at the view here, I've just got a simple index view which we can leverage, and much of the work that's going on to facilitate what we're wanting to do here is in the controller. I've got a couple action methods here. An index method and an about method. I'm going to create a new method here, a new action method, and I'm just going to response.write something to the screen. This is going to be called hello MVC, and we simply have, I'm going to use a parameter this time called name, and I'm going to response.write to the screen hello plus whatever the parameter was passed in. And this should be able to drive in some of this routing stuff that's happening under the scenes. So if we go ahead and just kind of run this as is right now, and we come up, we look at the URL, and we see that we're on the home, everything looks like we're on the home page. I'm going to just type in hello MVC. Notice the resource is not here. Directory structure is important here. I had actually added this. The controller is in the home directory. So if I type in home and then /hello MVC, you see that I get the hello. But at this point, we're not passing any URL stuff in. But notice these URL segments up here. The home is matching and routing to the actual home directory. And the hello MVC is a resource that we created an action method for, and down here in the controller class itself. So, and we're just referencing all this via these URL segments, and again, via the URL routing being set up that's allowing for this. And if I type in hello MVC !name equals .NET videos, just a classic query string parameter here, and you hit enter, you can pass query string parameters this way. This is actually that, query string parameter on the back end that we're expecting. And then we'll show in a little bit more depth here. Notice if I look at hello MVC, and I want to do it with not query string parameters, but with something called the URL segment itself. I do a /.NET videos. It's not showing up here. We're not displaying .NET videos on the screen, but you can accomplish this. You don't have to use classic query string parameters. You can have your URL stay very clean this way. You notice that if I come back in and I would just look at the actual action method itself, I'll make a simple change due to the routing we're using. I'll just change this name to ID. And we'll come back and look at kind of how this is all routing. But go ahead and rebuild this and rerun this. And by just changing that name to ID, this URL segment now for .NET videos ought to display, and there it is. We're actually passing a parameter with a URL segment, not a query string parameter, the classic one. We're passing it with a URL segment into the resource itself. So again, the routing mechanism up here, we're requesting resources. We're using actual URL segments. If I passed in something else there, to pass the parameter here into this action method. Again, requesting a resource, not necessarily a file on disk. Well, how are we doing this? If we go back and we look at our route itself again, remember we have ID here, which is the third segment in the actual URL routing mechanism we have set up here, and we could pass in multiple parameters here. You could wire up ID2, with commas, all within the same segment, and you'd be able to accomplish that as well. So this is a very flexible, somewhat foreign if you're simply a web forms developer and just jumping into this, but it's a very flexible way for you to basically create these routes again that can map to resources, and you can do this in the convention you want to. Again, by default, let me show you what we're doing here with some of the default stuff. Notice when I just return view on the controller for these action methods themselves, I'm using the index control or index view. Well, how are we doing that? By not giving MVC a name for the view, it's going to check the controllers directory, which is I've got the home controller here, so it says, okay, hopefully there's a home directory there, which there is, and there's the index view he must want. Same thing with the about action method. I just return a view here and I don't specify. It says, okay, I'm going to check the home directory and the views, which there it is, and there is the about view. So again, much of what you do in VC is a convention over configuration. You could certainly come in here though and override that and say, okay, return me a different view. And it would be checking again that home directory for this other view. If it existed, you would get this view returned. But you don't have to specify that if you're just going to use some of the default plumbing here that's set up. Again, convention over configuration, one of the common tenets or mantras of MVC. And so knowing how all this kind of fits together, hopefully these first two videos have showed some of that. You're going to have to dive deeper and deeper. Notice that when I come into the actual views themselves, you get something what's called the HTML helper class. You don't have to, although you have full control over how the markup is rendered, much of what you might want to do is already encapsulated for you in some of these HTML helper methods. And you can use these, with the IntelliSense here directly in your views. You notice I've got the HTML.encode. So common scenarios, common tasks, when you're rendering the HTML stuff, although you have full control, which is great with MVC, much of it's already helpful and already created for you so that you don't have to handle all of the plumbing, so to speak, to render all that HTML.